heavy,
bored.
Kurt Vonnegut was one of the most important writers in my life. In fact, he was the writer that actually made me want to be a writer. I worshipped his books, his writings, his letters to schools explaining why banning his books from their libraries was a terrible idea. And I still hold so much admiration for all of his work. I believe I always will. I would easily say to anyone who asked that Vonnegut is one of my 3 major influences as a writer. His humor alone is worth reading everything he's ever written, even if some of the works are, admittedly, less so. When I first started writing in high school, I copied his style, his humor, for years after I first discovered him, wanting to be him, have his career, his ideas, his jokes. My obsession with Vonnegut started when I was a teenager, knowing I was interested in books and literature, something I had admittedly fallen away from in my early preteen years, and got back into when I approached college years. My father handed me his beat-up old paperback copy of Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, telling me it was one of his own favorite books as a teenager. I still have that copy sitting on my shelf right next to me. Its old orange cover, yellowed pages, a corner of the cover missing, crinkled. The copy my dad read as a teenager. The same one I did. I read it in about 2 days, immediately hungry for more, then searched out every Vonnegut book I could, including his opinion writings. And to this day, though I haven't reread it in more than a decade, I'll admit, I would always say my favorite of Vonnegut's works is Breakfast of Champions, which I believe to be his funniest and most successful in terms of his style and his use of the language and his prose, as well as his drawings and his use of the sci-fi stuff. It just all works perfectly. Of course, I would never dare imply it was more successful, financially and critically, than Slaughterhouse-Five, what many call Vonnegut's masterpiece. And I would never argue with that. I can be objective, even when I have my own biases towards a book like Breakfast of Champions. But for reasons I will get into later in this episode, I did find myself, I'm sorry to say, a little disappointed in a way, rereading this. Disappointed in a way I never thought I would be. The book flies by. It's a tight little 200 pages or so. I reread it in a few days. But I did get a sort of unexplainable, hollow feeling from it all. And I kept asking myself, why? I suppose I wanted it to hit me over the head like it did when I first encountered it in my teen years. A big ask, I know. I asked myself if this was because I had gotten even more cynical, less cynical. Had I improved in terms of my craft, my understanding of literature? Or was it just that I'm too old and educated now to just enjoy things? A snob? I don't know. But I thought about that for a while. Why, reading this novel again, while very enjoyable, wasn't the same as my intoxication as a teenager encountering this novel for the first time. And I was fascinated by the techniques Vonnegut uses in this novel, in this read. His own self inserted into random pages, paragraphs, and then that opening first chapter, where Vonnegut's almost addressing the reader as part of the book. A genius move, in my reading, using it to set up the later insertion of himself in the prison camps, etc. I did briefly consider if this might be the first autofiction, but I also found myself wondering if that first chapter and the following self-insertions were to explain the thought process, how much he struggled to write this novel, what it took out of him. That brief 200 pages, taking years off his life to even produce. And I think that's why he wrote himself into that first chapter, the origin story, as part of the story. And I will continue to say this is a great book, one that should be canonized among the 20th century greats, but it does lack some emotional resonance due to the humorous use of Vonnegut's style. And I do keep considering the idea that maybe I'm asking too much of a book like this. But about halfway, I started to entertain ideas about why I found the humor almost too cynical, too simple in parts. And what I mean by that is simply that the humor almost overshadows the tragedy, the death that is constantly everywhere, all the time. I had never had this thought before, and really I was shocked to think it now as I reread one of my favorite books by one of my favorite authors. And maybe I'm being too sensitive, too grandiose, too pearl-clutching, but, that did make me think of taste maturing, as Bloom would say, interests changing, senses of humor changing. And unfortunately, that made me think of growing older. That maybe the problem was me, my too old and too mature brain, unable to goof off or play pretend as well as I used to. I'm not saying I haven't answered any of this, but I have been struggling to articulate it. I talked this idea over with my father some the other night during our usual Sunday night chats over video call, where all sorts of topics come up, everything from sports to news to dinners and events, anything. And I told him that I was rereading Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, a book we had bonded over, father to son. We talked, and he compared it loosely to some themes in All Quiet on the Western Front, as he had just watched the new remake on Netflix. And it dawned on me that maybe Vonnegut used the phrase, "so it goes," after every mention of death in his book, because he could not write it any other way. That if he tried to make a serious, straight drama about the bombing of Dresden, something like All Quiet on the Western Front, that Vonnegut may not have been able to stomach it. How much death was just casually laying on the sides of roads. That his introductory chapter about how he came to write this novel was his way of saying that to the reader. That he may believe the book to be a failure in that way. That he couldn't stomach the real horror of it and could only write it with his usual humorous bent. The cynicism as a shield in some way. But then the options are the same if we are cynical or not. The options are accept the horribleness all around you at all times, or worry yourself to death over it. Very humanist perspective. But then I considered the faking of acceptance. The pretending that everything horrible simply happens and there is nothing we can do about it. And of course, that is probably very true. All sorts of horrible things happen all the time, and no one can stop them. But the accepting of it, I don't know if I can. While I thought laughing off death and horrible tragedy was perfectly wise as a teen, I think of it less so now. And maybe that's my problem. I have a hard time believing anyone can just accept the horrible facts of the world with a shrug. The war, the murder, the death, the just plain unlucky, as Vonnegut would say. But this is the beauty of reading a good book. It forces you to reflect on these sorts of things. Billy Pilgrim, the time-traveling main character, only a conduit for contemplation. Our own mortality, futilely bumping up against roadblocks and horrible happenings for no good reason. This is life. So it goes. As Vonnegut says, almost as a poetic refrain in the novel. A chorus of death that keeps chirping up on every page. But I wonder if anyone can actually just accept it, all the horror, like Billy Pilgrim, a weirdo, a freak of nature, that maybe just accepting the horror of the world isn't in our normal programming, our machinery, as Vonnegut would say. That there will always be a few things out of our control that we can't help but desperately, hopelessly fight against it. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of it all, that we aren't as well adjusted and smart as we think we are, that maybe we are all just as scared as animals, just as unable to understand and contemplate the unfairness of the world, of death, of experiencing life for a brief moment before it's buried in the ground forever. How cruel it all really is. How futile. Death being so casual at all times all around us, as the death statistics at the end of the novel aim to imply, and us pretending it isn't, not thinking about it, at the very least. I think that's what Vonnegut may be saying in this novel, that the tragedy of life is almost as random as being, quote, unstuck in time, like Billy Pilgrim being able to move fluidly through space, time, experiences, death here, death there, tragedy everywhere. We can either accept it or fret over it. And if we accept it, we can either laugh or cry. Vonnegut chooses to make us laugh. And maybe that's the joke I found less funny as I get just a little bit closer to my own mortality each day. How accepting such an absurd fate can only be faked. No one ever really accepts it. So it goes.
Inner.
Resources. American resources.
Being bored?
Some activities are intentional, right?
It shows such a lack of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.